It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Stuart Kime, who is a certified English teacher, I learned, and has been teaching in the past for 10 years in different schools. He did his master and also his PhD in education at Durham University, and also served as a policy fellow for the Department of Education in the UK. So he did counseling there. Most importantly, and that's why we invited him here today, he's the co-founder and director of education for evidence-based education. And he will tell us in his keynote about what this is. Maybe in short for us, I think it's a great way of transforming scientific evidence into educational practice and making it useful in educational practice. So moreover, and that's where we actually got to know each other, he's a visiting international professor at the University of Tübingen, but also an honorary professor at the University of Durham. So when I got to know Stuart, I got to know him as a person who's really devoted to the question of how scientific evidence can be used to improve the quality of teaching. And I think this is the mission of his life, if you want to say so. I also got to know him as a person who's very nice to have a beer with at PhD retreats at very remote rural areas in the Swabian Alps, and as a good team player for playing pub quizzes in these places. So it's my very pleasure to welcome Stuart Kime and give him a warm applause.
Erstmals möchte ich mich entschuldigen, dass die heutige Präsentation auf Englisch stattfinden wird. Wenn das Thema Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte oder Dunkelbier wäre, könnte ich es wahrscheinlich auf Deutsch probieren. That's all of the German that I have. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak at this conference and for the welcome that you've given me. Before I speak to my topic, I want to let you know that I'm what some people have called a boundary dweller. I'm a connector, a translator, a communicator. I was once a high school teacher, but am no longer. I was once a school leader, but am no longer. I trained as a researcher, and while I could probably just about construct a randomized control trial if you asked me to, I'd have to get my notes out, and I'd need some help with maths. I've worked with and around policymakers and regulators, but I'm neither of those also. These days I use my experience in all of these diverse settings to connect people together, to help them to understand different perspectives, and to design digital learning experiences for teachers, and to test them, to learn from them, and to help others who are interested to do the same. So I'm not here to tell you a story about a radical discovery that I've made, so sorry if that's what you were hoping for. I'm here to tell you a story that you will be familiar with. It's one that involves standing on the shoulders of giants, thinking deeply about what we already know, about the problems and the choices that teachers and school leaders face. It's about making things, making digital tools, testing hypotheses, learning, adapting, and testing again. It's a story of a scientific method. But it's one that's applied in real time to the challenges of improving education at scale using digital tools. And it's the story of one small but mighty team's systematic attempt to solve the intractable problem of improving education at scale in a way that is authentic, sustainable, and replicable. And I want to really point out the work of the team that is behind everything that I'm going to talk about. I'm just the mouthpiece, really. I'm just here talking about it. And if you are watching back in the UK, and some of them apparently have joined the live stream, hello. So first, I want to take you back in time to start this story off with a question. When did this happen? Or when did these things happen? I know, look at the hope, the joy in my eyes. You can tell it's a while ago. When was this? What are you going with? 2011? 2012? I think, now I'm questioning myself, but let's say it's around 2010, 11, somewhere on the border. That's me when I was a school leader. I didn't last long, but let me take you back to this time. And it was a pivotal time in England because this happened. Have you ever heard the term bromance? So there you have David Cameron and Nick Clegg. David Cameron leading the Conservative Party, Nick Clegg leading the Liberal Democrats. And we had a coalition government, and nobody thought it would last for 5 years. What do you do when you think that something's not going to last? You start doing things really quickly. You go, and that's what they did. And they started to make policy really quickly. So over the last 14 years in our country, we've had a lot of change, a huge amount of change. This is just a list of the Secretaries of State for Education, the Ministers of Education between 2010 and 2022. I'd like to draw your attention to Michelle Donnellan. Can you find Michelle on the list? Michelle Donnellan was Secretary of State for Education for 37 hours. Change is good, right? Also, in amidst all of this, somewhere between 2010 and now, a thing happened that we're not going to talk about. You know, the Brexit thing. We're not going to talk about that, but I'll say on the day that it happened, I received an email from a colleague in Tübingen that simply said, "Why?" In our country, we've had qualifications change. So we used to grade things with letters. We grade them with numbers now. Those qualifications changed the curriculum as well. The curriculum was changed a little while back to include something called the EBAC, the English Baccalaureate. That was an innovation that happened to try to bring certain subjects to prominence, and others seem to get sidelined. So we've changed the curriculum, we've changed the qualifications, we've also changed how we monitor school performance. We came up with something called the Progress 8 measure, which is a value-added measure for schools, and also mandatory phonics checks for very, very young children. We've had developmental changes in the way that we train teachers and who can train teachers and what they train them in. After a few policy changes and some regulatory changes, it's very rare to find a teacher in England now who doesn't know something about working memory. So we've changed a lot, and along the journey, the evidence base has changed around us. Back in 2010, we didn't have an organization called the Education Endowment Foundation. It's a what works clearinghouse, and it really has had a huge impact on some of the decisions that school leaders make in England. And that evidence base has changed over time, as it does as we find more things and we add to our store of knowledge. And also, we've had changes in innovation, and this is one that I'm really proud of. This is something that we've been involved in at EBE. My colleagues Rob Coe and Arania Ventista have led on this work with the National Institute of Teaching, where we've been working to figure out if we can measure the contribution of an individual teacher to students' learning using assessment data that schools already have. So not having to provide new tests and add on layers and layers to find out the answers that we're interested to know, but using what already exists. And this is a huge project that keeps on going and is showing some really interesting results. And I want to give you a little bit of background again to England. And note here I'm talking about England. I live in all sorts of countries, I guess. I live in the United Kingdom, but in England, education is devolved. So, in the United Kingdom, education is devolved. So I will talk about the experience in England only. That's the one that I can speak about with some confidence and experience. So I want to give you some relevant details, just to give a bit of background to the work that we've been doing on this thing to improve teaching quality and to develop professional development using digital tools. So it's quite hard to recruit teachers at the minute, and we're not unique in that circumstance. I know that. But as you can see here, recruitment has been well below target. And it's more severe in some subjects than in others. Particularly here you can see in physics. Physics has been incredibly difficult to recruit to. But what do you do when you are finding it difficult to recruit people into something like teaching physics? Well, for governments, there are very few levers that they can pull, but one of them is money. And it turns out if you offer £10,000 to teachers to come from outside of England to train, you get an increased number of applicants to teach physics. So these things have helped, but still we find a real difficulty in creating a really strong supply of teachers coming into the labour market. Teachers' working hours have increased over the last year, and this is all with the background of efforts by government and others to reduce teacher workload. Back in 2016, I was involved in a set of projects that very specifically went out to study the effects of changing things about teachers' practices designed to reduce workload, and yet still we see that workload is very, very high. And now, 2024, we have a new government. So we had a general election just recently, and we moved from a Conservative government to a Labour government with a very large majority. So they have a huge mandate to get on and do things. And this is really exciting, and you can see here the new ministerial team led by Bridget Phillipson. So that's to give just a little bit of background to the work that I'm going to talk about now. And we know that improving education at scale is hard. However, we also know that teacher expertise is the key in-school driver of student learning. And this is important because it's provided one of the key foundations for the work that I'm going to talk about today, the Great Teaching Toolkit. There's lots of evidence that of all of the things that policymakers and school leaders can influence, it's what teachers know and do and care about that seems to have the biggest difference on students' outcomes by quite some margin. And high-quality teaching, or as I'm going to call it, great teaching, narrows the attainment gap between those who come from disadvantaged backgrounds and other learners. And great teaching is not some fixed quantity. It varies across classrooms, and it can be learnt. It can be developed and supported and nurtured. And for all of these reasons, my colleagues and I at EBE established the Great Teaching Toolkit project to create digital tools that help to improve learner outcomes at scale by building teacher expertise. So to help to make this a bit more concrete, I'm just going to show you the platform. This is it. This is just a quick snapshot. And if we've got time, I'm happy to bring it up and press buttons and show you what it does. But it's just an online platform that we've created that is accessible and directly works to help teachers to improve their expertise. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. This is another screenshot from inside. And I'll talk more about these things. But I just really wanted to give you a concrete picture of this thing. So, that's the thing itself. That's an online platform. That is the Great Teaching Toolkit. But before that, before there was any kind of set of digital tools, there was something else. There was a simple document that we published back in 2020. And it's what we called the Great Teaching Toolkit Evidence Review. And I put a QR code there so that you can download that. We set out to identify and review and summarize the best available international evidence about what teacher practices and skills and knowledge and behaviors are important for student learning. And you will, I hope, be pleased to know that when you get to the references section in that, you'll find loads of people that you know, some of whom are probably in this room. An awful lot of the best available international evidence comes from your country. I think that's wonderful. I've got a list of names here. I'm not going to read them all out, but there's absolute legends, I think, in the world of research. I am going to read some out. People like Tina Seidel, people like Eckhard Klima, Anna Katerina Pretorius. There's loads of people whose work in this country has informed everything that I'm going to talk about. And that evidence base that we identified and then reviewed and summarized gave us what we've called the model for great teaching. It's a credible summary of the elements of great teaching practice. So basically, the things that we know have an impact on learning. And from this, then, what we had was a curriculum for teacher learning, a shared language of teaching. And since 2020, the Great Teaching Toolkit Evidence Review has been translated into Modern Standard Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, Swedish, and Welsh. At present, there isn't a German version. But I am one of life's optimists. See me after if you'd like to. Anyway. Right. To help to get into this language, I want to do something, this is a bit of a risk, but I'm going to go with it anyway. We're going to have a quiz. Are you ready? So we're going to have a quiz about classroom practices. I'm going to show you 10 statements shortly. And those 10 statements, I'm going to ask you simply to say whether you think it's true or false. That's it. Okay? That's all I'm going to ask you to do. Now, I'm very aware that I'm in a room with a lot of people who really know their stuff. So let's not have any arguments or anything like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up my answers, or the answers that we've put into that evidence review. And then all I want to do is to see whether we have some kind of consensus, whether we have any agreement. This will be exciting. I've done this with loads of groups before, but never with a group like this. And you need to commit yourself to an answer. So committing could be on paper, or it could be on a device or whatever, but I really want you to have an answer to them. Here we go. Commitment is important. Okay, I'm mindful of time, and I'm going to ask you to do one other thing. In a moment, I'm going to just go through each of these one by one quite quickly. And at each one, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you think it's true. That's all. Okay, so let's start with number one, that students will only learn from a teacher that they like. Do you believe that that's true? If so, put your hand up. Have a look around, see what people are thinking. Thank you. Okay, number two, getting students to talk more and teachers to talk less leads to deeper student learning. If you think that's true, put your hand up. Okay, thank you. Number three, every lesson should offer differentiation, so different materials, different tasks, and different success criteria for different students. If you think that is true, put your hand up. Interesting. Look, we're already seeing division in the room. I love division. It's great. It would be boring if we all thought the same thing. Number four, teachers should praise all their students every lesson. If you think that's true, put your hands up. Thank you. Again, a diversity of opinion. Number five, even for experienced teachers, in most cases, improving their management of students' behavior will substantially increase students' learning. If you think that's true, whoa, okay, there we go. And you know, it doesn't matter which country I go to. Number six, every lesson should start with a retrieval quiz to reactivate previous knowledge. If you think that's true, put your hand up. Okay, thank you. Number seven, understanding students' learning styles can give us insights into how best to teach them. Put your hands up. Okay, I'm going to disappoint you in a minute. Number eight, great teachers should always aim to minimize students' cognitive load. If you think that is true, put your hand up. Okay, thank you. Number nine, when they explain a new idea, teachers should be spontaneous and authentic and improvise rather than script in detail exactly what they're going to say. If you think that's true, put your hand up. Thank you. And finally, students should spend the majority of their time working independently on realistic problems. If you think that's true, put your hand up. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you for playing my quiz. I like a quiz. On the next slide, I'm going to put up the answers, and then I'm going to duck. This is great. Okay. Now, because I have the microphone, I'm going to say we're not having a discussion now. And I know that some of those statements and the way that they're worded and what have you, it's contentious, it's challenging, and also it's in English, right? It's kind of unfair. But what just happened there when that little discussion started to emerge is one of the best things that I see happening in schools when I go and work with groups of teachers. Just to bring to the surface what we believe, and then to start to do the work of saying, well, in this circumstances, I wouldn't do that, but I would do it like this instead, and to really start to bring out the details, the expertise that teachers hold within them. You'll see on the right-hand side there that in brackets there are some numbers. And those numbers relate to something that I'll show you next, but it's this model for great teaching that I mentioned before. And so each of those things we're not going to have a discussion, but you can follow up the evidence trail that has led us to conclude those things. So, in summary then, with this model for great teaching, this work that we did back in 2020, we identified 4 priorities for teachers who want to help their students learn more, which I think is all of them. And I hope that these can then prompt reflections on the goals of the digital tools that we might all deploy and test and learn from with teachers. So 4 things, 4 areas. Great teachers understand the content that they're teaching and how it's learned, that they create a supportive environment for learning, that they manage the classroom in ways that maximize the opportunity to learn, and they present content and activities and interactions that activate students' thinking. So we presented a model that has 4 overarching dimensions, so we call each of those a dimension of great teaching, and 17 elements within them. And an element is defined as something that may be worth investing time and effort in to build a specific competency or skill or knowledge or to enhance the learning environment. And there's no implication here to say that the complexity of teaching can be reduced to just a set of techniques, a tick list. But the evidence suggests that the best route to develop expertise is likely to involve a focus on developing specific competencies guided by formative feedback in a supportive, professional learning environment. So to bring this to life, I want to then look at one of those dimensions and one element only, just to give you a little bit of an experience of this language, this shared language of teaching. And I've chosen to focus on dimension 2, which is creating a supportive environment. And this dimension, as I'm sure many of you will know, is one part of the German 3-dimensional model that Anna-Katharina Praetorius and colleagues published on just a few years ago. And it's at the heart also of the class framework by Pianta and colleagues. And that prominence probably reflects classes' early origins in early years classrooms with very young children. But there are probably some aspects of this dimension that are more important in certain classrooms than others, probably with younger children and more educationally vulnerable children, or for students who just find schooling to be a less positive experience than their peers. And to bring this to life, this shared language to life, I'm going to show you a video of somebody you have already met. It's me, summarizing the best available evidence using this common language that I've talked about. Here we go. The first element of Dimension 2 concerns the quality of the relationships between a teacher and their students. Teachers should show respect and sensitivity towards the individual needs, emotions, culture, and beliefs of their students, and that respect should also be reciprocated. Teachers should behave in ways that promote student respect for the integrity and authority of the teacher. Teachers should also convey care, empathy, and warmth towards their students and avoid negative emotional behaviors, such as sarcasm, shouting, or humiliation. And this element of great teaching is multifaceted and complex. However, there are 2 particular aspects of teacher-student relationships that deserve specific attention. Relationships with students with special educational needs and disabilities, and culturally relevant teaching. The requirement for respect and sensitivity towards students' individual needs is amplified in both importance and difficulty when those needs are more diverse or extreme. Developing good relationships of trust and respect with students with special educational needs, neurodiversity, or disabilities often requires specific knowledge and adaptation. Great teachers know their students well as individuals. They're well informed about the nature and requirements of their students' specific needs and have strategies to accommodate them. Another key part of this element is the need for teaching to be culturally relevant. Great teachers are aware of, respectful towards, and responsive to the cultural identities of their students. This is particularly important when the student's culture differs from and has the potential to conflict with that of the teacher, school, or college. In creating a supportive environment, great teachers ensure that good relationships and academic success are compatible with students honouring their cultural competences, values, and identities. On reflection, it's totally reasonable to justify the need for these positive student behaviours on grounds of social cohesion, decency, and human rights. But there's also empirical evidence that they are associated with higher achievement. And along with other important student outcomes, such as well-being and student attitudes. For example, evaluations of the My Teaching Partner intervention show that when teachers work on improving the warmth and supportiveness of classrooms, student outcomes improve. There's also evidence of benefits for improving classroom environment, and so we included this dimension in our model simply because, A, there is good evidence that it can have a small effect at least, that there may be some contexts or individuals for whom the effect is actually much larger, and also that there's good evidence for its impact on wider outcomes such as well-being and attitudes. So we have a curriculum then. The evidence review, when we published it in 2020, we just put it out online, made it freely available, and we were surprised by the response to it. It's become a shared language that allows people from diverse perspectives to talk about the same things in the same way, which seems like a really simple thing, and in a way it is, but the power that it holds is incredible, because school leaders and teachers can talk about questioning and feedback and relationships and motivation using the same words to talk about the same things. So with the curriculum in place, we went on then to develop the Great Teaching Toolkit, an online, scalable platform of tools to provide feedback for professional development over time, a collaborative environment and a development model to help teachers to work together on the elements of their practice that matter most. And my team's work on the Great Teaching Toolkit has always been grounded in the best available evidence and theory about how to improve education at scale. But many aspects of that evidence are currently lacking, and particularly in relation to how it actually applies in practice. So we think of the toolkit as our best hypothesis rather than a guarantee. And those best bets to help students learn more, the classroom interactions between students, the curriculum, their teachers, and the environment that enables it to grow and be deployed effectively. It's those combinations that we're focused on when we're thinking about developing teacher expertise. But what do we mean by expertise, and how can we help it grow? In their chapter in the second edition of the Cambridge Handbook of Expertise and Expert Performance, which I'm sure you all have and read regularly, James Stigler and Kevin Miller claim that, quote, most teacher education and professional development programs for teachers have focused on making teachers more knowledgeable. Few actually give teachers opportunity to practice the skills of teaching. Recently, some approaches to teacher development in England and elsewhere have moved in the opposite direction to focus more on classroom skills more explicitly. But these often seem to place less emphasis on teachers' theoretical knowledge. It's almost as if we can't have both, when indeed we need both. And both of these say very little about the importance of judgment and intuition. And my colleague Rob Coe has written that in some approaches to education improvement, judgment is ruled out altogether. Interventions require fidelity and are designed to prevent teachers from deviating from the script, driven sometimes by the fear of lethal mutations that often arise when individual teachers and school leaders make their own choices. And of course, there's a real fear about this, and it's important. Given a choice, many teachers, many school leaders, just like many of us in here, will make a bad choice. And our intuition is often wrong, and we're right to be skeptical of it. And so what tends to happen, and what I've seen happen, is that people try to prescribe and tighten the controls even more, trying to get more and more compliance to faithful implementation and fidelity. And in England, we've observed some school leaders also take this route, mandating what they call non-negotiables that all teachers must comply with. But again, there's evidence about the impact of this, and unfortunately such approaches to faithful program implementation have been found to have small effects at best. Aside from their kind of diminished view of the complexity of teaching, attempts to improve practice by tightening compliance are just simply not very effective. So we have a problem. And the Great Teaching Toolkit is a place where we think about judgment and intuition as crucial. So much of the complexity of classrooms and the interactions within them depends on the subtle choices that teachers make. And most of those choices are made well below the level of conscious awareness and thought. And not one of us here today can have observed a classroom and to see the practice going on in that room and not be struck by the importance of context. One very specific practice, approach, or strategy in one room will work amazingly. Do the same thing in a different context and it fails completely. So it follows then that the way that teachers adapt their teaching in context is actually a feature and not a bug. I want to move on and talk a little bit about the importance of deliberate practice and how deliberate practice is one of the ways in which the development of judgment, teachers' judgment and expertise can come about. To be able to adapt and apply things in different situations is to have what Japanese researchers have referred to as adaptive expertise, and you can go back to the 1980s and the work of Hatano and Inagaki. And sometimes people worry that focusing in on specific techniques and competencies can seem to oversimplify teaching. But as you'll be aware of the work of Pam Grossman and other colleagues, and I've heard about this today in sessions, decompositions of practice and approximations of practice, simulations, rehearsal opportunities offer really interesting and fruitful ways forward. And this is a way in which an area in which digital tools can be really quite powerful. And so this is when I want to get into the world of feedback inside the Great Teaching Toolkit, because in order to engage in those approximations of practice and those simulations of practice, one of the things that's required is for teachers to have feedback on their current practice in some way or other. And both goals and feedback are core parts of the Great Teaching Toolkit environment. And most teachers know about the power of feedback. And in the Great Teaching Toolkit Evidence Review, we summarize that evidence in both directions, giving students feedback and also receiving feedback from students. But feedback doesn't just help school students, of course. A classic review back in the 1990s by Kluger and Denisi on the impact of feedback on performance found positive effects on average in a wide range of contexts. But that review and then subsequent reviews since then have found variations in the effect size, including many cases when feedback harms performance, has a negative impact. Part of the power of feedback is that it provides a reality check. Despite our tendency as human beings to believe we can judge how well we're doing things, we're generally wrong. And we can go back to the work of people like Dunning and colleagues talking about the correlation between self-ratings of skill and actual performance being moderate to meager. So in situations where we do have good feedback, self-assessments of performance can be inaccurate, over-optimistic, and to put it bluntly, we're probably worse at quite a lot of things than we think we are. It gets more optimistic in a minute, don't worry. A lot of the feedback that teachers get on a day-to-day basis is actually a really poor guide to their own learning. They constantly evaluate how a lesson is going. They're looking for signs of confusion or flagging interest and tiredness. And my colleague Rob Ko wrote in 2013 that the things that are visible in classrooms are mostly poor proxies, as he called them, for learning. Perceptions of a teacher's role are hugely distorted, as is shown by the surprise and shock that most teachers experience when they see themselves teaching on video for the first time. If you've ever done it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And a lot of teachers get feedback from observations by colleagues, right, coming into the room and looking at their practice. But again, my colleague Rob Ko has written about this, and most of the judgments made by observers without specialist training are often wrong. Even without scoring or rating a lesson, if the judgment that underpins the feedback is wrong, then the feedback is unlikely to be helpful. But a number of studies have looked at the impact of interventions that feature feedback to teachers to raise the attainment of students. And although some do find positive effects, overall the picture is a little bit mixed. And I think there are three key reasons why. Feedback is brutal. If we acknowledge that we might not be as good as we think that we are, if we acknowledge that, then remaining ignorant is blissful. If I don't know it, I don't have to deal with it. Practical measures for feedback are really hard to make. And even if we want it, effective feedback is quite difficult to get. And the requirements for practical measurement in this area are demanding, and the expertise to make them is not universally available. And finally, acting on feedback is just hard. Even if you get really high quality feedback, the challenge of the hard work to actually do something with it remains. So the prioritization of feedback within the Great Teaching Toolkit has been influenced by an area of research that foregrounds the power of feedback: improvement science. Improvement solutions have to be fit to the context in which they're supposed to work. So they have to be developed in conjunction with the people on the ground, teachers, the ones who do the day-to-day practice. And on the screen here, I put up an example of feedback that features inside the Great Teaching Toolkit. Indeed, this is feedback that I got on my own teaching a couple of years ago. This is on one of those elements of great teaching, on specifically explaining. And I've put one of those sections on its side so you can read it a little bit better. But this is student perceptions of teaching at the class level, but focused in on very, very small parts of the best of what we know about how good explanations seem to work. And these pieces of feedback like this are used by teachers who use the toolkit to figure out where they might spend their time and effort, What's the highest leverage thing for them to work on with a very specific class of students? So quite quickly we can move on from generic ideas about get better at explaining to maybe incorporate more worked examples into your explanations when you're introducing a new process. And there are certain things about feedback that can be really helpful. It holds up a mirror. It can help teachers to see their classrooms in a way that's broader and clearer and more accurate than their own raw experience can provide. It's about motivation as well. And if you get feedback on a repeated basis, it helps teachers to see the progress that they're making. And with that example of the feedback I just put up before, we've seen teachers use that repeatedly during school years to track their own progress. Nobody's doing it to them. They're consciously choosing to do that themselves, and the effect on their own motivation could be quite significant. But feedback can also focus attention on what really matters. If we can get the measures right and we can deliver feedback to people in ways that is personal to them, then that feedback can help to draw an attention between actual performance and desired performance to help people focus on what really matters. And it can also clarify what good looks like. It can help you to understand, at least theoretically, some of the key aspects, the core content of certain parts of your teaching practice. And feedback really is the key that turns turns experience into learning. Without it, we just keep on doing the same things over and over. So I'm going to just conclude by showing you little bits of the toolkit, and then I'm going to open up for questions, and then I will definitely finish by 6:30, because literally I'm sure you all want to go and have dinner. And so do I. I said that setting goals is an important part of the process of using the toolkit. So we know that professional development that incorporates as part of it goal setting, understanding building, so understanding theories and evidence and so on is important, as is the development of skills and the embedding of habits. So we've created tools to help people to set goals that then are only based upon the best available evidence, but not just the best available evidence generically, but that which pertains to their own practice by combining feedback tools as well as that shared common language of great teaching. They can pick strategies in there, set actions, commit to actions. This is an important part of the way the toolkit works. You have to look people in the eye and you have to say, I'm going to do this thing by Thursday. And then when Thursday comes around and they look at you and they say, have you done that? The feeling is not one that anybody wants to repeat. There is something powerful about goal commitment, as we know. How do we help build understanding? So we've created courses. There are courses inside the toolkit that are asynchronous. People do these on their own. They do them in pairs. They do them in small groups. And they cover all of the dimensions and elements in the model for great teaching. So if you want to build your understanding, there are tools there for you instantly. These courses have been translated into Arabic and are now used in the United Arab Emirates as part of a training program for 23,000 teachers there. Trying to build knowledge in ways that helps people connect theory to practice is what these things are all about. But we also build understanding in another way. A few years ago, we got really, really tired of Twitter. I don't think we were the only people who were getting tired of Twitter. There's lots of good stuff that people share widely, so what we figured was, could we start to curate some of those things that were being shared widely? Podcasts, videos, books, articles. And we did that, and we read and watched lots of things, and then, crucially, we started to tag them to dimensions and elements. So a teacher who doesn't want to take an 8-hour course, who only has 5 minutes, can have a look on there and find that that takes 4 minutes, and they can read it pretty quickly, and it gives access to people who perhaps are coming at this from a different perspective. This has been a real kind of labor of love. We're now up to about somewhere in the region of 500 separate resources, which is, and that grows month by month by month. We also have a video feedback tool inside the platform. And this is a rather wonderful tool to help people to see their practice more clearly and to get feedback from colleagues. This one's about questioning. You can see we've got a rubric down the left-hand side. And very simply, I could use this for self-reflection. So I could just give myself some feedback. But I can easily tag in colleagues in my school, and I could choose who I tag in and ask them for feedback, and they'll use that rubric, which makes the job of giving feedback so much easier. It constrains it to something that is manageable. And I've used this myself to get feedback on my own explanations. I did this once with a talk similar to this. I set the group in the auditorium a task. And whilst they were getting on with the task, I put my phone here, and I then set it up to record the next explanation that I gave. I then finished that recording, set another task, uploaded it to this website, tagged 5 of my colleagues back in the office. They gave me feedback on my explanation, and at the end of my 45-minute session, I showed the feedback to the group in the hall. It's so quick to get multiple people to see the same thing and to give their views on it. And the neat thing about this tool is that those people don't see everybody else's feedback. They only see the video. And these inside the platform, this video feedback and also the student survey feedback that I showed you only is seen by the teacher themselves. Their line managers, their bosses, their colleagues do not see that unless they choose to share it with them. And that's crucial for us because we're always trying to balance out autonomy and accountability, always trying to find a middle path between those. We try to help people embed habits as well in the toolkit. So this is an example of just a development plan that comes at the end of a course. You take the course, you say, this is what I'm going to do. You make a commitment to it, write it up, set some dates, set some actions, and so on. So it's just a very simple tool, but one that's been reasonably powerful. We've also created functionality to take away some of the administration for doing professional learning. So simply, who is going to do what and when? So inside the toolkit, we have what we call great teaching teams. And we can set up teams of 2 people or 5 people. We think that the optimal is 4 to 6 people. Small enough so that everybody is heard and everybody feels the need to get involved, but not big enough that you can hide, but also not so small that bad ideas can dominate. And that's just another screenshot in there where we've got a team there, the metacognition group of 3 people, and they can set agendas for their meetings and then tick off actions when they're done. And all of this records in the background to create a profile for those teachers that they can then download to say, here's what I've been doing. I'm going to conclude and just give a short opportunity for questions in a moment, but I want to say a couple of things. If teacher expertise truly is the strongest determinant of students' achievement, and the main function of professional learning is to develop expertise, then how we think about expertise really matters. It doesn't just grow naturally with experience, but it can be developed given the right conditions. It requires a balance of knowledge and skill and judgment, and professional development, for it to be effective, needs to address all 3. And as we've learned a bit more about how to make the Great Teaching Toolkit work in practice in a wide range of contexts, the tools within it and how they're experienced are already changing. We test and learn and adapt. And schools and colleges and their teachers who use the toolkit, yes, they get a set of tools. They get courses and resources and video feedback tools and student survey tools that should help them to be even better than they already are. But if you took that toolkit, you tipped it over and you shook it out, what you have is a research project. And those schools, those teachers, those leaders are part then of something much bigger, a systematic attempt to solve this big problem of improving education at scale in a way that is authentic and sustainable and replicable. Thank you. I think there's time for a few questions if anybody wants to ask questions. I am mindful that I stand between you and dinner. Any questions? Don't all rush at once, it's okay. Take your time. I have a question for you. I talked about a shared language of great teaching. He has a question. I talked about a shared language of great teaching, which is now being used in England in lots and lots of schools, and teacher training providers and universities and the regulators are starting to look at things like this, and it's all very exciting. Could a common language, a shared language of great teaching exist in Germany? Could we all talk about the same things in the same way, using the same words? Let's make that a rhetorical question. Oh, there is a question here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation of the toolkit. It's very interesting, but my question is, how do you reach all the teachers who we think are involved in hard work and have no time to spend on this toolkit and work together, even if they want?
Yep.
They have other problems to solve. How do we reach everybody? Because we want to do it at a big scale.
Great question. Great question. And one of the things I was going to talk about today, which I didn't, is time. We know that in England in particular, in fact, have a guess. What proportion of a teacher's time is devoted on average to professional development in England? Give me a percentage. We've got 5 there, got 10. You are all very optimistic. 1. Approximately 30 minutes per week. And even then, urgent things push out important things. So how do we do it? Firstly, when we work with people who are interested in the toolkit, we say that there is a role for leaders to play in this. And school leaders can do certain things that teachers can't. They can prioritize time to be used in certain ways. So firstly, it's about leaders taking action to ensure that sufficient time is set aside. And sufficient time for us, we would say, is 1 hour per week. That's enough. But after that, then that just carves it out. If we can prioritize it and create space, then there's what do you do in that time? And that's where using the tools to guide through a very specific process of setting a goal and then working towards achieving that goal, getting feedback on how you're doing is what needs to come in place. Sometimes, one of the things that happens when people use the toolkit that makes it go completely wrong is after a leader has made all this effort to set aside time, to prioritize it, to show real value to it, to celebrate teachers' professional learning, they leave the school, somebody else comes into their job, and that person often has what I like to call bright ideas. And they change things, and then all of a sudden that hour of time that teachers had to reflect on their practice, to learn a bit more about their practice and to try something new, it goes. So we have to acknowledge that. The other way that I'm seeing increasingly people use it is that they are tying professional learning to performance management and appraisal. So increasingly I'm seeing people, and in fact, I've got a meeting later this week with a group of schools who have taken that model for great teaching, those 4 dimensions and 17 elements, and they're turning that into their teacher competency framework, and then that will be a part of their appraisal cycle to say, which of these areas have you been working on, and what have you done to get better at those areas? So there are kind of structural ways in which incentives to use time with the toolkit can be made, but ultimately a teacher has control over only a small number of things, and oftentimes they can't control the timetable. They can control what they do in time if it's protected for them. I hope that answers your question. Does it?
A little bit. Thank you very
much. A little bit. I'm more than happy to talk afterwards. Please.
Again, thank you very much for your inspirational talk. It's also for us in the German context maybe a very inspiring perspective to have a great teaching toolkit. But my question to this point is, I know quite well the English system of teacher education, which is primarily done by PGCE courses, and
it has changed, actually.
Or maybe a very intensive phase of lecturers and professors working with the students. And in the German perspective, it's a 10-semester study, which means we have educational studies, we have subject content studies, and so on. Yeah. So there's maybe a cultural challenge to adapt the great teaching toolkit to the German perspective. Could you elaborate a bit maybe on the cultural specificities of your teachers you're working with?
Yeah, so in our country, in England, we have frameworks that are set out by the government that say teachers must learn this and they must learn how to do that. Interestingly, what we found is that there is a really strong alignment between what those frameworks say and what the evidence also says. So that's a good starting point. But in our cultural context, a lot of teachers increasingly do not do a PGCE and the kind of university route to teaching. A lot more is now school-centered, where almost from the first week you are in school and you're working and preparing as a teacher in that way. So in that context, what teachers need is accessible tools to both build their theory and their knowledge, but also practical ideas, techniques that they can go and take away, and then tools to get feedback on those things. So it's starting to be used in some of those teacher training contexts in the early stages of teachers' careers. It's being used more later down the line to build out a kind of a full program of continuing professional development. But one of the things that I'm really interested in with this toolkit is not to go around to anywhere, not to come to Germany or to go anywhere and say, hey, we've made this thing and it's perfect, you should do it. But to work with people who are interested, to share what we've learned and to say, if you want to build something similar, why don't we work together on this? It probably won't look a lot like this because this was built for a different context, and it will definitely have German words in it. But that kind of collaboration is so important because, as I said in my talk, context is so important. What works in one place does not work somewhere else. So if anybody wants to work with me and let's make toolkits, let's do it. I'm totally up for this. Any other questions? There's a question in the top right there. Katerina. Yeah.
The meeting here dealing with digital learning.
Yeah.
So do you think that the context will shift in a way that a lot of empirical database is not fitting to the system any longer? So even the role of teachers will change during that adaptation or transformation.
Okay. So the question is about, does the empirical evidence that we have right now, is that going to be relevant and salient as technological changes happen and societal changes happen? Great question. I wish I knew the answer. My instinct is to say that we know a lot about what great teaching is and the constituent parts of it. We have always, as teachers, had new tools that come into our lives, changes that happen. I think that, and this is just my instinct, I have no evidence for this, I think that dimension 2, the one about creating a supportive environment, will become increasingly important in a lot of contexts. I think a lot of the content knowledge, I think teachers will still need to have deep content knowledge because I think AIs will hallucinate for a while. I think that teachers will need to have deep understanding of the fact that homework is now dead, because children would just press the big button and do far better than they ever have before. So what this tells me is that we have to invest in continued excellent empirical research. We have to keep learning so that toolkits like that, or whatever form it takes, are trustworthy and credible. If we're going to have evidence-informed practice, the evidence that we use has to be believable and trustworthy by the people who are using it, be they policymakers, teacher trainers, teachers themselves, or school leaders, or indeed parents and the community more widely. So I think it will change. I hope it does change, because that means we get to learn more stuff. But I think I know enough about AI to think that it's going to happen a lot more quickly than any of us thought.
We've already talked about cultural differences. I would like to direct my question into this way. Has the fact that you rank school performances in your country, does this fact help to install new concepts because there is a kind of pressure in improving?
Okay, so in England, there are lots of ways of ranking schools. One of those is that Progress 8 measure that I mentioned before. Another way is through an organization called Ofsted, which is the inspection body, the regulator, who until just a few weeks ago would grade a school with one of 4 words. Your school was either outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. They've now removed that one-word judgment, but there are still rankings there. Those rankings do drive, they focus people's attention. In some ways, they focus people's attention on the wrong things. So they focus people's attention on the test itself, and then ways in which you can do really well on the test. And we've seen evidence of this with the Year 1 phonics check for very, very small children. The pass mark for the Year 1 phonics check was 32 marks. And when we aggregated the data, when we looked at it across the whole country, what you saw, if you imagine all of the scores from 0 up to 40, there was a very flat line until we arrived at the number 32, and then it went like that. Because teachers are thinking, hang on, if I don't do this, then my school is then somehow, worse at phonics, and therefore, okay, we'll pass the test. So it has negative backwash in the system. But when it focuses people's attention, and I take the example, for instance, of the regulator and the inspections and what have you, it can be quite helpful. There are adverse consequences always, and unintended adverse consequences, but I want to point to one thing from 2019 when Ofsted created a new inspection framework, and so inspectors are going around schools and they're using this framework to make judgments about school quality. In that framework, they started to talk about teachers understanding how to help to manage cognitive load. All of a sudden, loads of teachers go, what? What is cognitive load? And then that started them into a whole journey of cognitive science that probably wouldn't have happened had those words not appeared there. So there are always adverse and often unintended adverse consequences, and sometimes very serious ones, to that ranking and what have you. But in some ways, the devil's in the detail, and how you do it. I'm a big fan of Bananarama, the 1980s pop group, and their song, it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it, and that's what gets results. So I don't think we should ever shy away from making judgments about quality, particularly in schools. It matters too much, and there are too many things to leave, freely for people to make all the choices that they would like. But we also have to be aware of the potential negative implications of some of those things. I think that was a really political answer that I've just given you that says, well, yes, it's a good thing, and no, it's a bad thing, and then let's end there.
Okay, so unfortunately, it's really you or dinner. So
thanks for staying.
Thanks also to the audience for the questions. Thanks to you, Stuart, for this lovely input, and actually we are very happy to have you also on the international board of the Kompetenzverbund Lernen Digital, and to learn from you and what you're doing in England. So I wish you all a nice evening. Some of you will be there tomorrow as well, yeah, enjoy the rest of the evening. And thanks to you, Stuart. So we made a little bit of package for you, including
chocolate,
analog stuff and German chocolate.
Some good analog things. Thank you so much.